Well, in order to make the most of our time, I want to start right out. And I want to start this with the person who got me involved in this whole opportunity today, and that's Paul Gouin, who I've known for the past 38 years. I believe, and I really believe, that he has contributed more and risked more trying to bring an end to whaling than any other individual alive. That comes from his unmatched generosity, which means that he, along with Sidney Holt and Paul Watson, are the three most effective people in reducing commercial whaling. Paul is a graduate of HEC of Paris, the best business school in France, and he has built and sold several businesses while living a Spartan life himself. He spent much of his resources on a series of master strokes that were critical in reducing the take of whales until the 2008 financial crisis temporarily wiped out him financially. He's in the process of organizing a new startup based on his new method for parents to teach arithmetic to preschool children. During his many actions in favor of whales, Paul Gouin got nicknamed the Phantom because he appears out of nowhere to strike a blow for whales, then retreats to some faraway tropical beach. He's now surfaced again with a grand idea. He proposes an ethical ban on commercial whaling based on several ethical arguments against whaling, starting with the scientific fact that the neocortex of several cetacean species is more complex than the human neocortex. As Paul points out, the International Whaling Commission, a consortium of nations which is responsible for the protection of whales and is better known by its informal name, the IWC, its acronym, has a rule, the IWC has a rule that if minimum of 2 IWC member nations make a proposal about anything, the IWC is required to discuss it and to vote on it. Other entities, such as the American Association for the Advancement of Science, of course the biggest scientific association in the world, have discussed ethical bans on whaling, but no IWC member country, has made a formal proposal to the IWC. Paul's effort would be the first in that regard, and he has a record of winning. For example, he co-founded Greenpeace Australia in 1978 in order to organize protests against the last Australian whaling station, which was in Albany, Australia. They drove rubber Zodiacs famously between catcher boats and sperm whales. Paul drove several of these forays himself, which is just my way of pointing out that he doesn't lead from behind. In that same year, he was the biggest individual donor to Greenpeace. In the 80s, he owned the Dolphin Research Center in Florida, in the Keys, for 4 years, where he supported experiments of the language learning ability of dolphins. His research got results similar to the results that were obtained by the Dr. Lou Herman of Hawaii about the same time. In 1981, as the commissioner for Panama, we'll get him to talk about that, at the International Whaling Commission, Paul was instrumental in passing a moratorium on pelagic whaling, i.e. open ocean whaling, for all whales under the IWC jurisdiction. The American proposal for a complete moratorium, pelagic and coastal, was going to fail when Paul proposed two separate pelagic, to separate the pelagic moratorium from the coastal moratorium to gain the votes of coastal whaling countries. This pelagic moratorium is today little remembered because in 1982 a full moratorium was successfully voted, but it was crucial to that process. A moratorium, by the way, that Paul Gouin helped bring about by supporting the costs of bringing in 4 new member nations that then voted for the moratorium that is currently in effect, but then which the Japanese bought. And then, of course, Norway, Japan, and Iceland still ignore that moratorium completely, and they take more and more whales every year. In 1992, Paul Gouin was the originator of the idea of creating an Antarctic Ocean sanctuary for whales, which everyone assured him would never get the required 3/4 majority. But he got the French government to propose the Antarctic sanctuary with the help of Greenpeace president, the late David McTaggart. During the next 2 years, the anti-whaling countries progressively accepted the idea and started to put pressure on the countries that were recruited by Japan. Finally, in '94, the Antarctic whale sanctuary was voted by 25 votes against and a single vote for I mean the other way around, for the sanctuary, and then a single one against, cast by, guess who? Japan. The ethical ban that Paul Gouin is suggesting is something that has my full support and that of several other people who know far from bitter experience the difficulty of getting such bans passed. However, because they've seen him operate in the past, as have I, they support him fully. He's confident that $100,000 would ensure that at least 2 countries will propose an ethical ban on commercial whaling at the next meeting of the IWC in Slovenia, which is in September of 2020. This idea of finding $100,000 includes no salary for Paul. The whales have always received his services pro bono. I'm hoping that this meeting, with its history of interest in the conservation of whales, may become interested enough to support Paul Gouin's plan, both politically and financially. Now is our best chance in decades to actually succeed in stopping commercial whaling and doing so at a lower cost than has existed before. Such a step would be a gift to one's grandchildren that would be hard to equal. Paul.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you to come and listen to my proposal. I'm not much of a public speaker, but I have some precise idea about what I want to say. By the way, some people call me Paul and some people call me Jean-Paul. Generally, people that call me Jean-Paul are the people that are involved with stopping whaling and defending the whales. I live 2 kind of parallel lives. One, most of the time, I'm just a normal businessman, and part of the time I come with some idea which I try to get through. And in particular, my passion has been to stop whaling, period. My luck is that most of the whaling is regulated by one international convention, which gave birth to a commission, the International Whaling Commission. And I've been involved with the commission off and on for the past 40 years, starting in '78 when, by some long story, I got nominated commissioner for Panama. The idea that I present, an ethical ban on commercial whaling, is by no means my idea. It has been offered and discussed by many people, including recently in 2012 in an annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which held a session in the meeting called Declaration of Rights for Cetaceans, Ethical and Policy Implication of Intelligence. So in that proposal, we definitely have the backing of the majority of the scientists expert in the issue. It's not some kind of fancy proposal by some, hippie. So let's see how the IWC works. The IWC right now is composed of 88 countries. Each country has 1 vote. And anytime 2 countries make a proposal, it has to be voted. So my plan is to get 2 countries, at least 2 countries, to propose the ethical ban on commercial whaling and get a vote. The way the balance of power in the assembly is today is that roughly 60% of the countries are against whaling, and 40%, 3 are whaling countries, and another 20-some countries are essentially bought by Japan to come and back up their position at the IWC through programs of technical assistance to their fisheries, and God knows what else. So this proposal would get, I would say, safely, you can say that it would get more than 50% of the vote, but it's not sufficient. It has to get 75% of the vote. And to get 75% of the vote, that you're talking about a quantum jump more difficult to get that kind of percentage. To give an example to see how it works, there has been two proposals in the past years. One was a proposal for the South Atlantic Sanctuary, which was proposed by a group of Latin American countries. And the other one was a proposal for the Antarctic Sanctuary called the South Ocean Whale Sanctuary, which was proposed by France. The proposal by France won after 3 years of debate and pressure on those smaller clients of Japan, until in Mexico, in Puerto Vallarta, it got 25-1 votes for it. The other vote for the South Atlantic Sanctuary never got off to 75. For the past 6-7 years, at every meeting, it gets between 60%, between 55 and 65% of the votes, because there has been no pressure put on, there's been no coordination at the level of the anti-whaling countries and pressure put on the small country backing Japan. So the idea would be to be like the French proposal. Right now, to give you a brief idea, there's a moratorium in place that was voted in '82 and came into force in '86. That is essentially a zero quota, that indefinite zero quota, which was accepted by everybody except Japan and Norway. So Norway is the only country today which I consider is still whaling illegally, because they filed an objection saying this decision doesn't apply to us during the normal period where you are entitled to do that. Iceland did not object, but later they withdrew from the IWC, so they lost their right to whale legally. So they withdrew from the IWC, and then several years later, they re-entered the IWC with an objection, which most people think it's totally, illegal and absurd that you can, once you lose your right to whale commercially, all you have to do is to quit the commission and re-enter with an objection. But nevertheless, that's the situation right now, with many countries that have protested. And I think if some country wanted to go through the trouble of suing on that issue, they probably would win, but nobody is doing it. Now, finally, Japan filed an objection, but then within 2-3 years, the US put enormous pressure on them, because in those years, they were fishing in North Pacific American waters, and they essentially told Japan that if you don't withdraw your objection, we're going to cut you off from all those fisheries, which were much more valuable than whaling. So they withdrew their objection, and then they immediately came back with a program for scientific whaling. Now, scientific whaling is in the convention, any country can give itself a scientific permit, because I guess the writers of the convention never thought that it would come to anything huge, but Japan is applying it to it's essentially commercial whaling with a fig leaf on it called scientific whaling. It got
a worm-eaten fig leaf, yes.
It got Australia sued Japan in front of the International Court of Justice and won. And Japan decided to ignore the ruling of the court, which is generally done by people like the president of Sudan after massacring a bunch of people in Darfur, for example. So and that time we came with with that's at the time we came with the idea of the sanctuary in the Antarctic, because the only large whale population really left are the minke whale in the Antarctic. So we thought if it becomes a sanctuary, it will be hands-off for Japan. No such luck. You know, Japan went and carried on its scientific whaling in the sanctuary in the Antarctic. So now, me and many other people, except I'm more in a situation to do something about it, we came with the idea of an ethical ban on commercial whaling, which is a ban that's not based on the number of whales and whether there's enough whales to have any kind of sustainable whaling, but based on all the reasons why whaling, excuse me.
We'll switch topics ever so slightly. Janet is the executive director of the Orca Relief Citizens Alliance, one of Mark Anderson's oldest organization, the acronym for which you'll notice, Orca Relief Citizens Alliance, is, well, Orca. Very good. And she'll tell you about the efforts that they are making right now.
I appreciate sharing some grief up here. I think yesterday we were introduced to the idea of fear being motivating. But I think grief in its way is a much greater motivator, and it's very unfashionable. I know that grief has been my motivation to be an activist in terms of the environment, in terms of economic justice. So I really appreciate the grief and the sensitivity and the sensibility that comes behind, that actually pushes the science forward and the commitment forward. I am not a scientist. More than 20 years ago, in the Pacific Northwest, in the Salish Sea, we have a very special, unique group of orca whales. They're called the Southern Residents, and they live there. It's their home, the Salish Sea. They don't travel around the world. Speaking to Mark Anderson, he knows all the science about why they are at the top of the orca chain in terms of their intelligence. They're matrilineal. They stay in their families. They breed through relationships with the other pods. They have extraordinarily complex language. They have indications of deep emotion. Many of you may have seen very recently the plight of a calf that died very, very young, and the mother carried it around for weeks in a display of grief. And it brought a tremendous amount of attention to the southern resident orca whales. So we're talking about ethics. And when I saw that photograph of that mother whale with the baby carrying that calf when it was already dead, in an example of grieving, my first thought went to the ethics of that photograph, because the science is very, very clear. The interference with echolocation of southern residents is an interference with their ability to actually be, to see, to hear, to sense, to communicate with their families, their environment, to know where they are, to know where their food is. So my question was, why are we being told that this young whale, this baby calf whale, lived for an hour? And why are we seeing a photograph? To me, it implied invasion, interference with echolocation that was probably required at one of the most sensitive times of life between that baby and that mother. Irony is that that photograph impacted a lot of people to pay attention to the sentience of these whales. All the attention on whaling, which seems to me to be a total no-brainer that we should be banning whaling. We have a small group of whales that we're trying to preserve. They're extraordinarily extraordinarily unique. We've applied to NOAA to get a whale protection zone, but we're coming up against the whale watch industry. And when you speak about ethics, I have found in so many situations that environmental organizations in protection of the whales are getting money from the whale watching industry. So there's this complex ethical challenge regarding the almighty dollar that comes into play. I will give you one very brief story. I spoke to a woman. I live on San Juan Island, home to the Southern residents. She has a land-based whale watching nonprofit, and she was telling me how busy they were and how much they needed help. And I said, maybe Orca Relief could help. But I have one question. Do you take money from the whale watching industry? Without a hesitation, she said, I can't make them go away, but I can take their money. The fact that she said that so quickly was such a red flag in the ethics department to me. This is a very, very small story compared to the international challenges. But to me, it indicates that money is always involved in ethics and unethical behavior. And I want to just honor Mark. He started the Whale Museum. He had one rule, and it was science-based, and there were universities involved. And his rule was, if you were researching the whales, you weren't allowed to say where you'd seen them for 24 hours. The Whale Museum, other people in the Whale Museum took another tack. They wanted to take people out to look at the whales. They were going to exploit the whales. Mark got out of there. Ethics, I looked it up online, the definition. Ethics is morals in action. So even though the word ethic applies often to systemic behavior, as in business and so on, its foundation is within the morality of the heart. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's leave it there because I want to hear some words now from David Gruber, who is a National Geographic explorer. He's a presidential professor of biology at the City University of New York. He's just come off a Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard University. He's doing some very interesting stuff. Please, David.
Well, first off, I mean, I'm just an honor to share the stage with you all and to think about some of the people on stage, just how big of an impact you've had in starting the Save the Whales campaign, in changing public consciousness and dialogue about this important issue. And as a researcher, I am just coming into the whaling area, and I really see myself as standing on the shoulders of everything you created. And I think the idea that we could even have a moratorium on whales is just so important. One of the things I think about now is we spend a lot of time looking outward. We're shooting rockets out into space, and we're thinking about life on other planets. And in our ocean, we have some of the most majestic animals that have brains bigger than ours, highly encephalized, just amazing creatures. And we are in an interesting position where we have to use our brains to save ourselves. And whales really represent the perfect creature to connect to. It would be a bigger human feat if we could understand what the whales are saying using AI, machine learning, any technology that we've had to connect to nature, to connect to life, to stop killing them senselessly for this guise of scientific research, which, as I was talking to Paul last night, they've only published 2 papers. So, you know, the thing is why, and we have the power, and we have the capability, and we have the mindset, and we don't have the possibility to live on another planet. One thing I was analyzing at Harvard last year was talking to medical people. Our eyeballs, our cerebral spinal fluid, were meant for this planet. And if we were to find a whale on Mars, do you imagine the headlines that we would get? We find a little bit of water and we get excited out there. I mean, we have heaven on earth right here, and we have the possibility to support Paul in this ethical ban. And I think that following up the movement that you started is just so important, and I want to take my career in that direction and following your footsteps. So thank you all.
Wonderful. Do you have any?
Yeah, no, I can carry on now. So the idea is simple. The idea is not mine. I'm just more aware of the functioning of the IWC and what's feasible and what's not feasible. There are 88 countries, so it could be a country that's already a member. Some country would propose a moratorium, but some of them haven't paid their dues and their fees for a few years. And if they were helped to pay those fees, they would be a candidate. Any European country would be a candidate, but they have to reach a consensus, which takes a long time. So between one country trying to make a proposal and all of them agreeing on it, it can easily take a year. Any South American country is probably a good candidate. The candidate could also be one of the small client states of Japan that would be convinced to change camp. One candidate could be a country that does not belong yet to the IWC, and as soon as they become a member, they can make proposal and they can vote. So there's all kinds of possibilities. So I'm quite confident that I can get two countries to propose me and many people that I know, to get two countries to propose the ethical ban. It takes some money to run around and do what has to be done. And I figure that with about $100,000, I'm confident that in the next meeting there will be two countries, or at least two countries, because once two countries propose it, the other ones start joining. And so a month ago, I was talking on the phone with Roger, and he told me, why don't you come and speak at that meeting that I go every year? And Mark Anderson invited me, and that's what I'm here today to see if somebody is interested to participate in something that I think is fairly efficient in terms of bang for the buck.
Let me suggest, are there any questions? If anybody has questions they'd like to ask to any of these speakers. Yes, please.
I'm curious, what's Japan's interest in the whaling? Is it financial or is it cultural?
Okay, I have written 3 sheets that you find on the table. If they run out, I will print some more. And I analyze exactly that, which has always puzzled not just you, but many people. And the conclusion that I have reached is that it's really run by a very small cabal of people at the top of the Japanese government that basically is led by the Prime Minister Abe and the Ministry of Fisheries. And it's their own private interest as bureaucrats and politicians to carry this on. And in Japan, they control public opinion because essentially all the media come to the Ministry of Finance, the press conference, and they toe the line that's put out by the Ministry of Finance. And if they don't get invited to the press conference. So essentially, all the Japanese media are telling the same story about how those foreigners are trying to impose their culture on poor us Japan. But because it's incredible the harm these people are doing to the public image of Japan around the world by breaching several international treaties, and for what? For their own narrow interests. But they control the situation. Just one more thing. Yeah. I Googled the other day Nanking massacre, and you get something like I think like 300,000 hits. You Google Japan whaling, you get 2 million hits. So they're getting more harm in international public opinion from their whaling than from their behavior during the Second World War.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you all very much.